Well, yeah. Yeah. But you can be independent. It's time to begin tonight. Got a few announcements we want to make before Stan leads us in some songs. If you didn't pick up one of the midweek newsletters, you might want to do that. They have a lot of folks that are sick. Mary Catherine Eddy has COVID. She's at home. We've got several people that have had recent bouts of that. I know Jane Hunley, and I think Jackie's Vicky has had COVID. I don't know, about a half a dozen folks here that have had a recent bout of that. So remember those folks in your prayers. Mildred Edwards, Jen James' grandmother, has terminal cancer. We prayed for her before. The Buellers request prayers for Corey C.J. Hall. He's leaving for the Army on August the 1st. Y'all have seen this young man, been visiting with us here for some time now. But yeah, he's going to be leaving August the 1st. So we need to remember Corey Hall in our prayers. Phyllis Hill, I didn't know that. Phyllis has COVID. That's the first I'd heard that. Randall Hill has had severe bleeding issue develop. He's been sent to a specialist for a consultation, so remember Randall. Debbie Klingler is recovering from COVID. She's feeling a lot better, but low on energy. Mildred Manning has COVID. These I did know about. Junior Schrum is home. He's continuing to recover. Vicki Thompson has COVID as well. And Kevin, his successful knee surgery was yesterday. He's had his knee replaced. Saw a video. Looks like he's getting around pretty good. Looks like he still knows his way to the kitchen. That was the direction he was headed, wasn't it? I believe him. Yeah, he was. So Kevin's doing good. I'm glad to hear that. So maybe he'll be back with us soon. There's some other announcements in here. Youth group news. You can see Nathan about that. Time for the Magi boxes to be turned in. They have to be due. They're due back this Sunday. So if you're taking part of that good work, make sure you have your box back here by Sunday. If you have anything else, we can make that maybe toward the end of our worship service. Right now, Stanley.
So I got mixed up. I told Kevin I've been praying for his hip. What am I sorry? I was praying for the wrong joint. He said, well, I wonder why my hip was feeling so good. I know that my Redeemer lives and ever prays for me. I know eternal life he gives, from sin and sorrow free. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life
In keeping with our 1 John study, we're going to talk just a minute tonight about what we studied some last week, or the last time we met, in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9. John talks about confessing our sins and God being faithful to forgive us. It's almost the same words that's in James chapter 5 and verse 16. And that sounds good, but as with so many things that we have to do, or things that we have to try to do well as Christians, sometimes saying is easier than doing. What does it mean for us, and why is it so important for us to confess our faults one toward another? You know, there's lots of things we could talk about there, and as we study 1 John, we'll talk about some of these things maybe a little bit more and more. But one of the themes that John will have as far as a practical application of Christianity is being able to be humble. In the Beatitudes, Jesus talks about the very first one that he mentions there in Matthew chapter 5, being poor in spirit. And for a long time, as a younger person, I never really wrapped my mind around what does it mean to be poor in spirit. In fact, he goes so far as the poor in spirit will inherit the kingdom. To me, poor in spirit is this: being smart enough or wise enough to know that you are in trouble and you need help. It's a statement of humility to be poor in spirit, a broken spirit. Some of David's Psalms talks about having a broken spirit and a contrite heart. And one of the things that people in the first century had trouble with Jesus, and even today, is some of the things Jesus said were just so completely opposite of what we as human beings see. When Jesus would say, if you'll take my yoke upon you, your yoke will be easier. Well, it doesn't make sense. You want me to take on other people's burdens and be concerned about them, and that's going to make mine easier burden. Well, it may not make sense, but if you're like me, if you've put that to practice it does work. How many of you maybe get caught up maybe in your own concern so much, but if you go out and you see to the needs and help some other people, that you feel better about yourself? It doesn't make sense, but that's what Jesus said. So when he talks about being poor in spirit, he's really saying this. To be poor in spirit means that in order for you to be happy and enjoy things, you have to have a broken spirit first. And that maybe doesn't make sense. But the fact of the matter is, I've seen it put to play in my life. A broken spirit is when you finally reach the point where I can't do anything else for myself. I have got to have God's help. I have got to have Jesus Christ interceding for me. And when you reach that point and your spirit is poor, and when you finally reach the point of humility that you realize that you have to have help, that's what we're going to talk about some tonight. It's okay, too, to admit that, and not just through Jesus Christ and God the Father, but us, helping each other, confessing faults one toward another, also helps the poor in spirit. Being poor in spirit is a hard thing, because in this life, and especially maybe in the culture we live in, pride is something that I think will probably cost more people their soul than anything else. You can't be prideful and be poor in spirit. You just can't. And everybody in here of any age at all, you have been broken. You've been to that point that your spirit's been broken, and you've known that there's nothing you can do for yourself. Maybe you've just decided to try to go it alone. Bad mistake, especially for Christians. Being poor in spirit's important, y'all. And we'll talk about that some more as the weeks go on. Being humble, knowing that you need help. If you're sitting in the audience tonight and you think maybe you're that self-starter and you're that self-made person and you don't need anybody's help, wow, you have led a charmed existence. Because if you've lived any period of time at all, man, woman, child, I don't care, there's something that's happened in your life that's told you, no, you cannot make it on your own. You have got to have help. And that's the poor in spirit variable that I'm talking about. If you need to respond tonight, maybe there's some things in your life that you'd like to confess. Maybe being poor in spirit and humble, that's something that you struggle with. Maybe pride, something that you wrestle with. I don't know. But I know tonight we're here to pray for one another, to confess our faults, if that be the case, and to strengthen and encourage one another. It is the greatest and most underappreciated blessing that Christians have. It really is. So if you need to respond, do so now. Stand, leads us in a song.
Oh, do not let the world depart and close thine eyes against the light. For sinner, harden not thy heart. He saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight, not tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight, not tonight. Wilt thou be saved? Then why not tonight? Tomorrow's sun may never rise to bless thy long deluded sight. This is the time when we rise. Be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight, not tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight, not tonight. Will thou be saved? Then why not tonight? Our God in anger still, and will thus his love requite. Renounce at once the servant will be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight, not tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight. Will thou be saved? Then why not tonight? The world has nothing left to give. It has no room, no pure delight. Oh, try the life which Christians live. Be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight. Oh, why not tonight, not tonight. Will thou be saved? Then why not tonight?
Jack, you have our opening prayer, don't you?
Dear Lord, we thank you for this beautiful day you've given us, Lord. We thank you that you've given us your Son, Jesus Christ, who has gone ahead and prepared home for us. Lord, we thank you for your word so that we can listen to you daily as we read and study and reflect on the inspired letters that were written to us. Lord, we just ask that you make us strong enough to be weak, Lord, that you make us wise enough to have the full spirit. We just ask that you prick our hearts so that we can be that light, so that we can go and make and baptize and teach those in a world that needs you so much. Lord, just thank you for our youth. Thank you for the little ones we see here tonight. They are our hope, and they are our responsibility. Lord, thank you for your Son, for it's in his name we pray. Amen.
Dismissed. Oh, that was no big deal. Be saved. What? I kept hearing voices coming from mine. Y'all could have been making faces and stuff, and I wouldn't even know. You did, didn't you? Yeah, that would surprise me. Hey,
How come that Nashville airport of yours is all messed up, man?
ain't my airport anymore. You saw what happened when I left. It just took 3 years. I know. I couldn't find my way around in it now. Yeah. Last time I flew out was a year ago in June, and I had to ask somebody directions. I didn't know where I was. Yeah, it's terrible. No, you're not the only one I've heard complain about that. Well, what happened was, it used to be an airport. Now, it's a parking garage with an airport attached. Because the parking is a cash cow, y'all. I'm telling you. Even 20 years ago, the long-term parking, that's what generated most of their revenue. If they couldn't get federal or state taxes, the parking garage, even back in the late 1990s, a month, it'd bring in $2-3 million a month. Yeah, it just dragged. And back then, it was all cash. There weren't anything. It was all cash transactions. We got a call one time that the air conditioning had gone out down public parking at the time that had the contract. And we went down to this room that they had. I kid you not, it was the beatest thing I've ever seen. Me and Jim Martin, rest his soul, we come through the door, and they had a table. It's like 2 of our tables back there together, and it was piled up with cash. I'd never seen anything like that before. And they were in there counting. It was like something you'd see on like a movie, like back in gangster time. There was a guy that had like this little green thing, you know what I'm talking about, the little visor, and they were over counting. I said, what in the world? Look at this. But yeah, and the thing about that, you know, you got to wonder, man, what a temptation. Oh, wow. Yeah, it was all cash. There was a guy that ran that. He told me, he said that can't do it anymore, but organized crime, one of the businesses that they bought into was public parking, because they could launder large sums of money through their parking businesses. So what he told me, and you know, he had to, yeah. And he sat back in a chair with a big cigar and said, "Let me tell you something." No. That's what I was told, Jack. That's all I know. And when we walked in there, they said, you know, if you leave here and you tell anybody this, we'll kill you. I said, is that a joke? No. We'll pick up kind of where we left off Sunday night. There is one thing that I didn't get into Sunday night that has to do with light, and it being one of the characteristics of our Lord and Savior, God the Father too as well. And y'all can look at, we won't spend a lot of time there in, I think it's, where did I leave off? John, the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. I don't want to leave this out because it's pretty important. I talked about all the things that light we can do, why it's so important and stuff. And it's not so much now, but especially in ancient times. What's the one thing you could do in the daytime that you couldn't do at night? It's not so much now. There was one thing you could do in the daytime that at night it was just it was impossible to do. That's a good one. Talk about that. Work. Yeah. In John chapter 9, verse 4 and 5, Jesus, he tells them, he said, you know, there's going to come a time you're not going to have me. You're not going to have the light. And he also goes so far as to say, you got to work while there's daytime. You got to work. And the idea he's conveying there to his disciples is there's time and opportunity while you're alive, as you're Christian, to work. But there's going to come a time you're not going to have that. So there's a spiritual darkness in the sense that, you know, we talk about the devil, but there's also going to come a time where we're not going to have time and opportunity to work anymore. We're not going to have time and opportunity to let Jesus Christ shine in our lives. I think it's important for us to realize that every one of us, you might not have the same amount of years, but how many of y'all have more than 24 hours a day? Or less. Teachers have a little less. See, we all have the same amount of time. It's what we do with it. Do you think time and opportunity is something, as far as spiritually speaking, God gives to all of us? Time and opportunity? Do you think we'll be judged based on what we do with the amount of time we've had and the opportunity we've had to do it with? It's important what we're doing tonight, and I certainly don't want to minimize that. But as far as time and opportunity goes, as far as being effective in changing people's lives for Christ, in your life, where do you spend more time? Here? Where do you spend more time? Work? School, maybe? So, as far as Christ is concerned, and as far as Christianity is concerned, where is it more beneficial for you to be that light? Here? Where are you going to have more time and opportunity? Work, or wherever you happen to be. That's where you're going to have more influence. So I think it's important, and I didn't want to skip over that. When Jesus talks about you got to work while there's day, you got to work while there's light. Man, I've had to work nights. No good. I hated it. First of all, everybody else was out, going to the movies or whatever, and I was stuck at the airport breathing jet fumes, and that's no fun. Working at night, it's just, I don't think there have been studies about that, people that have worked night shifts, that it's not very healthy. They don't sleep well. I didn't. I didn't know whether to get up or go to bed midway through the night. So, spiritually speaking, it's important for us to take our opportunities. And here's the deal. It's important for us to realize every one of us will be given an opportunity to speak for Christ. Kevin's dad had an illustration he used the day he spoke to us about a woman that he knew or had worked with that didn't say a whole lot, was very, I guess, unassuming and quiet. But people would ask her, and she would then tell. There was a lesson for that I wished he had expounded on a little bit more. How many of y'all have been worshiping at a congregation maybe where, like before a gospel meeting or something, they did a door-to-door knocking thing? Done that? And I'm not trying to pin anybody down there, and I'll share my own thoughts. How many of y'all have seen a positive result from the door-to-door knocking? As for me, I didn't see much. Now, that's just me. Maybe it's where we went. I can think of maybe 2 exceptions to that, and that's important. Their souls are important. But as a whole, I just didn't see a whole lot from that. Now, on the other hand, the people that I can think of that come to mind who were brought to Christ through somebody's personal influence, not having a tract at the door, but through somebody who they observed at work or school, and then they ask, "What are you? Where do you worship?" Then there's a response, "Well, I'm a Christian and I worship at Berea." You see the difference what I'm talking about? And I'm not saying that one's more important than the other. I am saying this, though, that if the time and opportunity, if you're truly living like you should live, and somebody sees something in your life that they don't have, and they'll see that if they're exposed to you long enough, because I've seen it happen to me at work before, if they're exposed to you long enough, and they know that maybe you're going through some of the same things or have that they're going through, and they're struggling with something, they will ask you. How many of you have been at work and somebody, because they know your relationship with Christ, have asked you to pray for them? Why did they do that? They knew that you maybe had something that they didn't have. I mean, that's an honor. Listen, y'all, if somebody asks you to pray for them, that is a super, super big honor. It really is. It speaks highly that they feel that way towards you. Now, that's the opportunity then to say, well, I'll be happy to do that, and maybe have them share with you. Eventually, the door will be open, and instead of trying to put a tract or hit them over the head with the Bible, I'm telling you, you can be a whole lot more effective by those people knowing that you care about them and knowing that you have something they don't have. Yeah, well. Yeah, please.
All these religious folk and all of our friends in these different religions who say they were saved either by faith only or grace only, I cannot possibly see what they do with this passage of Scripture. I mean, if words have meaning,
yeah,
that cannot be true. The second thing is, you may recall a conversation with someone who's retired and getting kind of lethargic and lazy and so on.
You talking about me? No, we can see.
The background of that was somebody, you may know, Hugo McCord was a scholar, Oklahoma Christian, and a missionary. He translated a version of the New Testament, gave the proceeds free Hartman.
Mm-hmm.
Free Hartman version, what he called it. A first-class scholar. And he lived in Portland. And when I first started going up there for various reasons, and he was shuffling, but he was still preaching at some little church. And he reached the point where he couldn't drive the little church anymore. And he started writing articles. And a friend up there preaches in the same
him 165 articles a month. So that
Wow.
he kept busy till the day he died.
Yeah.
And he recognized, just because we have this U.S. retirement
Right.
does not mean that God has.
No. No, I think it was just like, and I know he was kind of apprehensive about it, but Kevin's dad that Sunday morning, he'd had a stroke. And Kevin said he was nervous. He was scared. And maybe for the first moment or two, but you could tell either out of habit or just knowledge. Once he got started, it was pretty easy for him. But you're right. Age, I think the church too, we do ourselves a disservice. It's our culture, we're kind of unique in the world. A lot of people, cultures in the world, and ours, you kind of like, somebody gets up of age, Christian or whatever, and you kind of like, well, you just, they're used up, just push them over to the side. But that's not how a lot of other folks work. In fact, multi-generational families have older people with them, and they're revered. I mean, they're looked to for their wisdom and their guidance and stuff. So in the Lord's church, I think about our little fellas back here in the back. We have so many good teachers now that spend a lot of time and effort with them, and I appreciate them. But I wish maybe we had more exposure to some of our older members. I know Dad, off subject, Dad always liked talking to some of the younger. He always liked fooling with Kobe. He thought Kobe was funny. He had that little fake tool belt that time. Dad talked about that. Kobe had his little Fisher-Price tool belt on. Come to church one Sunday morning. Dad thought that was the grandest thing. That boy, he's gonna make a wireman one day. He was right. Well, he's close. You're a lineman. You're not all the way there, but you're close. But yeah, we should keep working, Weldon, regardless. And you're right. That passage. As long as there's daylight, which basically means as long as there's life in our lungs and our Lord hadn't come back, keep working. There might be some folks out there that are waiting for you to talk to them. But anyway, work while there's time and opportunity. Let me get on where I was supposed to already started. Chapter 2, verse 1. John uses a term here, a term of endearment. My dear children, I write this to you, so that you will not sin. Now, he talks, if you're not careful when you read this, it sounds like he's talking out both sides of his mouth, but he's not. He says, I write you don't sin, but if you do sin, what he's going to talk about here is something that all of us struggle with. In fact, Paul talks about it too. No. Does God want you to sin? No. Does God know that you will sin? Yes. Those of you with your young'uns, do you want your young'uns to act right? Yes. Do they? No. So again, and that's why he starts this passage off with, my dear children. He's recognizing them as that. I write you this so you'll not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. Again, don't talk about it as enough as we should. Jesus Christ, we talked about this Sunday night. He's the perfect sacrifice because he walked in a human form. He is the Son of Man and the Son of God. It's a crazy, crazy thing. There's a lot of religions in the world that have different bits and pieces, I guess, of what we could read in our Bible. But you will not find any out there that ever profess that somebody that was God lived as a human being without sin. It's just not out there. There's different versions of different, I guess, good things you could pick from all of it. But the gospel message and what we have here, there's nothing else that's preached like it. It's just not out there. In fact, there were Christians even in the first century that struggled with the idea. In fact, John writes this book because of the Gnostics that struggled with the idea that how in the world could God, the creator of the universe, live as a human being? The concept was crazy. But that's the gospel. He is atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also the sins of the whole world. Preached about this before. Kevin's mentioned it before too. Listen, y'all. Jesus Christ, this may come as a shock. Jesus Christ came here and He died for everybody in the whole world. Not just North America, not just Southeast United States, America, not just the state of Tennessee, not just Middle Tennessee, and not just Wilson County. And sometimes we get caught up in our own little world. Frankly, even if you talk about us as a nation, somebody here that one of my teachers, what's the world population now? It's in the billions. 7 billion. Population in the United States, 500-600 million maybe? How much? Okay, even as a country, as a percentage of the entire world population, it's pretty arrogant for us to think that somehow or another we've got a monopoly on Jesus Christ. Does that make sense? Did Jesus Christ die for the other, 6.5 billion people? Oh yes. Oh yes, He did. But sometimes we get caught up in that Jesus Christ, somehow or another, is some kind of North American novelty. And that's dangerous, y'all. It's dangerous. Do you think the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus makes it pretty plain, it encompasses everything, that somehow or another that's compartmentalized and that somehow or another we're more important than Christians are sold somewhere else? Listen, y'all, this may seem like a given to some of y'all, but I'm going to tell you, I've heard brothers in our own brotherhood say things that are pretty close akin to, no, they're not. I have heard it. And this has always kind of troubled me, and I have heard this. And it's not to say that there aren't souls just down the street, but it does speak to a mindset if you're not careful. I have heard this said by good brothers. Well, why are we going over there to that other country when we got souls that need saving right here? Are there souls that need saving right here? Well, sure they are. No, they're both true. But it's not a neither or. That's the thing. That statement is made as a divisive thing to say it's an either or proposition, and it's not. It's not. All the souls are important. And if you can be effective preaching the gospel in Botswana and saving souls, it doesn't make any difference if you're preaching it there, if you're preaching it over here on Green Street. And somehow or another, we got to get away from that. People need to hear the gospel all over the world, and if we have the resources to preach it down here on Coles Ferry or preach it in another country, then we got to take advantage of that. I'm just saying there's a danger there. When John says that He died for the whole world, that means all races, all nationalities, all cultures, everybody. And this. Do you think maybe that I heard a preacher say this one time, and it's true, that everybody should have the right to hear the gospel at least once before people hear it multiple times. There are people right here in this county right now, they've heard the gospel preached to them hundreds of times and they've not obeyed. Hundreds of times. And maybe never will. Do they have more right to hear it hundreds of times than somebody over here has the right to hear it once? Think about it. I think there's a lot to be said, too, for familiarity breeding contempt. There's a movement in this country where I guess we've been saturated with Christianity so much, maybe it's not appreciated as much as it would be somewhere else where they don't have it. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I'm sorry, Mike, you have your hand up.
I think it's also means not only for the whole world today, but for every human being that's ever lived.
It's timeless. It's timeless. Yeah. We've talked about that some on our Wednesday night classes, that somehow or another, it's not just where we are, we get caught up in that, but when we are. Like right now.
This is not a new problem.
Right. Yeah.
All you have to do is open up books.
Yeah.
There was a lot of folks thinking that nobody could come to the Lord except those that were Jews.
And even the ones that won't had to conform to Judaism. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, when John wrote this, that probably had a lot to do with what he was thinking. And he was a Jew. Yeah. There's just, when you read about Christ in His whole life, I mean, it was so apparent in his whole life that he loved everybody. Now, he knew his marching orders. The gospel was to be preached to who first? The Jews first. And he did that. There was a few exceptions. He healed some folks because of their faith, but he knew it was for everybody. But he still, this is a side note, there was a promise made a long time ago. Why did he hold up to it? Who was it made to? Abraham. God does never, I always take comfort in that. God doesn't break His promises. He made the promise to Abraham and He kept it. That's exactly what happened. He knew that everybody was going to be taking part of it, but He still kept His promise to Abraham. So it's to everybody. We know that we have come to know Him if we obey His commands. The man who says, I know Him, but does not do what He commands is a liar. Now, John's already made a serious condemnation early on in verse 8 and 9 about if you say you have no sin, you're a liar. And also, if you say you have no sins, what do you call Jesus Christ? Yeah, a liar. You know, there's a lot of things in the Bible that are serious. Wow, you don't want to be caught up in that, because you're basically, the Father realizes the devil. If you do that, kind of indirectly, you're comparing Jesus to who? The devil. Bad news. But now he says the same thing again. The man who says, I know Him, but does not do what He commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. If anyone obeys His word, God's love is truly made complete in him. This is how we know that we are in Him. Whoever claims to live in Him must walk as Jesus did. We talked about that some Sunday night. To walk as Jesus did. Now go back to what he says earlier. He says, I write this so that you don't sin. And then he says, but if you do sin, and I've said those kind of things before to Tucker, I don't want you to do that. But if you do, this is what you... So John's saying this, but he said we got to walk. This walk, we talked about that some. We talked about Sunday night. What does it mean, since it's pretty important, since our soul depends on it, what does it mean to walk in the light? The walk is Christ's walk. How did Christ walk? Let's start with that. If we're supposed to imitate that, how did Christ walk? When He was in human form, which John makes it he starts this out, and that's exactly how he started out his gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and he goes so far as to say the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay, now when Jesus was here, walking in the flesh, what is it we got to imitate? In fact, he says there's some commands. We'll look at those too in a moment after somebody jumps in there. How are we supposed to live?
Well, He's perfect, and even though He's perfect, He stayed real close to God. He prayed with Him often. Prayed with God often. You know, I think that says something.
Got to cope with it.
He spent time with God.
Close connection, kept it even while on earth. What else? If you think about Jesus Christ, remember we talked about this some last week, some of His qualities, light, but what else? Worked. Hard worker. Constantly pouring into others, even to the point where He was exhausted, physically exhausted by it. Yeah. What would He do? We talked about this some Sunday night. When He was asked, what's the greatest command? What did He say? And the second is like to it. Okay? You talk about Christ's walk and walking in the light. We'll start with that. Love God and love your brothers yourself. Now, we won't get to it tonight, but he'll also go so far as to say that there are commandments, and if you love God, you will keep His commandments. So it's not a hit or shot, kind of like, well, I love God, but I don't like what that says, so I'm going to do this. No, it doesn't work that way. There are things, now we're not under the old law. We don't have to have animal sacrifices, and we don't have all the burdens of the old law. But even under the new law of liberty, there are rules. There are some things that God expects from us. Jesus also said, this is how the world will know that you're mine, is if you love one another. Now, when you got folks on the outside looking in, and they're wanting to see a group of people and maybe give you the opportunity to ask or answer some questions that they may have about how you worship. But if they look or they hear through other people, and those folks at Berea, they are constantly at it with each other. You know, I know somebody that went there and they had to leave because of blah, 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 blah. Oh me, oh my. Folks, let me tell you, when Jesus says, this is how the world will know that you're mine, is if you love one another, and then people can come up with something like that, you don't want to stand before God one day and have to give an account for that. You really don't. It's serious business. There are some things, as a group of people, we'll always fuss and fume because we're family, and that's what families do. But don't be that family member that goes out and tattles or tells other people. Does that make sense? You know, those of you, your family, your biological family, stuff goes on in your family. I've told you before, I got family members that, there's a Paul Foreign song, sometimes I don't like the folks I love. But that's natural. That's going to happen. But do you go out to a total stranger and badmouth them? I hope you don't. You might beat them personally, but don't let somebody else talk about them. And that's what we're supposed to be as brothers and sisters too. Don't get caught up. Don't get caught up in that, because you can disagree with somebody. You can, maybe strongly disagree. I think about Paul and Barnabas. That was a serious disagreement. They even parted company. But can you see Barnabas going out or Paul going out and say, "That Barnabas over there, we disagreed, and I don't know what." Can you see him doing that? It wouldn't happen. Do you think the other brethren knew that Paul and Barnabas had an argument? Well, sure they did. They're bound to have known. But can you see either one of those two guys going out and try to badmouth the other one? It just don't happen. So that's what people have got to see love in us. Dear friends, I'm writing, now he talks about this, he goes back, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one. We'll talk about this in just a minute. This is a pretty good one. Command this message that you have heard. Yes, I am writing you a new command. It is truth. Its truth is seen in him and you, because the darkness is passing and true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates his brother is still in the darkness. Whoever loves his brother lives in the light, and there is nothing in him to make him stumble. Again, pretty plain. If you can see where you're going, you're not going to be so apt to trip over something. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks around in darkness. He does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded him. Let me go see. I want to look at another passage real quick, and then we'll wind this up. If you want to, you can turn your Bibles over to John chapter 13. I told you all the other night we're going to be moving back and forth a lot between the Gospel of John and this letter, because some of this stuff he reiterates. John chapter 13, I hope I got this right. Yeah, verses 34, 35. Now, this is Jesus. Now, John just said, I'm giving you a new command. Then he says, but it's not really a new command. It's one you've already heard. And this is where he's already heard it from. Jesus says in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, a new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Now, John says it, but he says it in a different way. But basically, he says it's a new command, but it's not really a new command. Now, I get back to what I said before. How important, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this so y'all don't get up and stone me. Jesus says it, John reiterates it. He says, this is how people are going to know that you're mine. And what does he say? How are people going to know that you're mine? If you love one another. All right. How important is it for us to baptize people for remission of their sins? Because, as John will say later, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And that is a commandment. In fact, Jesus says, Mark 16:16, you go into all the world. So it's a command. That's something we do. How important is it for us to have the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning? Well, it's essential. It keeps us connected to God. All those are important. All of our items of worship. So don't misunderstand what I'm about to say. But what does Jesus say, though, is paramount for people outside those walls to know that we're His people. That we baptize or that we observe the Lord's Supper. How are they going to know? What's the first inclination that they're going to see something's different about Him? Amen. Y'all, it's not hard. Now, the other stuff we got to do. But how do you think people out there are wondering about, will they have a piano down there? Or is that the first thing they're thinking about? No, it's not the first thing they're thinking about. But do you think they're going to be wondering about how Lee talks about his brother or how he maybe goes out and ministers? That's what they're looking at. If you're really wanting to know or have influence people, that's where it starts. It doesn't start with a Bible tract that says, well, this is what you got to do, yada, 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 yada. That's not where it starts. Hopefully that's where it'll end up, but that's not where it starts. It starts with what Jesus says. It starts with what John reiterates over and over again. And so now I'll get to this, and then we'll quit, because I don't want to go any further. Do you just think that barely we might be more effective in reaching people out there if that's where we started instead of maybe on the other things? Just a thought. Sometimes it hurts my feelings. How many of y'all have been out, maybe at school or work, and have the church, not necessarily here at Bibie, but maybe the church in general, brought up in a negative way because of somebody or their family member or friend that had a negative experience with either a congregation or a member at a congregation? Because I have. It hurts my feelings. And I will defend the church, but sometimes it's hard to defend an indefensible action that somebody has been terribly mistreated. One of the things that really bothers me, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with just member and member, but maybe somebody in the world that has maybe had a business dealing with somebody and were cheated by somebody who's a member of the church. Wow, terrible. It's hard to get around that. So this loving one another, John is really going to drive that point home until he gets to the point about Jesus Christ coming and living in the flesh. Here's the deal. I get back to the walking in the light. Yes, all of these things that everybody mentioned are important. But to walk in the light as Jesus in the light, and that having His blood continually cleanse us, has to do with this. Really, in a nutshell, it's the same thing that He told the fellow in his day. You love God and you love other people. If you can get those two, and those are hard to do, because again, it's easier to say than to do. You love God and you love other people. If you can get that right, all the other stuff falls into place. In fact, Jesus went so far as to say to the Jew, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Can you imagine? Just those two sentences encompass all of the Old Testament, everything we have. If you can just get those two things right, then you're okay. So we'll talk about that some in the coming weeks, because the devil's always in the details. How do you reconcile with a brother that maybe you're at odds with? Maybe there's something that happened to you in the church, and you're still struggling with it because so-and-so did this. There's so many things that in order to love one another. And here's the deal, y'all. We got to get past. You're not in the Lord's church. You don't have to be everybody's best friend. Even Jesus had kind of an inner circle part. He loved everybody, but He tended, Peter, James, and John were kind of together. So it's okay. You don't have to be everybody's best friend, but still love everybody, and we can still hold everything together. So there's a lot of things that we need to talk about as far as keeping us together, still loving one another, so when people look at us from the outside, they'll know they're different. They're godly people. And every one of us in here is old enough to have seen something that has happened in the Lord's church in your life that was not the case. It was an ugly matter. So we'll talk about that some to come. Well, I'm done now. Anybody have anything else? We got about 6 minutes there. Does anybody else come to mind that we maybe know that may be sick that we weren't aware of? I didn't know about Phyllis. I didn't know she was sick. Then. She wasn't. Yeah. Marianne's been sick. She's been pretty sick. She don't talk about it a lot. She's been pretty sick. Anybody have anything else? Sunday is supposed to be, I don't know what we're calling it, but I had it last year too, kind of pray for all the teachers and get them all spanked off to a new start. So look forward to that. I have no idea what the order of worship's going to be, but I know that's what it's going to be. I think Megan was telling me that she had, I guess this is teachers and teachers' helpers and everything else, like 30 little prize things. That's a lot of people for a congregation our size, but I know we got a lot of teachers, but I know we had that. We don't have that many. What a blessing. Nothing else? Buddy, I think you're lined up to lead the closing prayer, if you would, please.
Dear Lord, we ask that your Holy Spirit will guide us into seeing the things that we need to see, hearing the things we need to hear, and to take action by walking in the light. Bless us as we leave this place of worship back into the world. Guide us and direct us. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
One more thing before we talk about this again Sunday morning. Think about this. When Paul was persecuting the church, do you think